In July 1944, somewhere in the tangled maze of Normandy's hedgerows, a mechanic-turned-sergeant crouched beside a pile of scrap metal salvaged from a German beach obstacle and conceived an idea that would save tens of thousands of American lives. He had no formal engineering training. He commanded no battalion. His name appears in few history books. Yet within weeks, his improvisation would help shatter the most fortified defensive line in Western Europe and accelerate the liberation of France by months. This is the story of how one man's moment of clarity in a killing ground changed the course of the war. The hedgerows of Normandy were older than gunpowder. For 1,000 years, Norman farmers had built them, thick earthen banks crowned with gnarled roots, blackthorn, oak, and hazel, each one marking a property line or livestock pen. The banks rose anywhere from 3 to 12 feet high, dense as concrete at the base, tangled as wire at the crown. Between them lay small, irregular fields, rarely more than a few hundred yards across, connected by narrow sunken lanes that time and wagon wheels had carved 15 feet below the original ground level. To a tourist, the bocage was picturesque, a patchwork quilt of green. To an American soldier in the summer of 1944, it was hell with a canopy. The initial landings at Omaha Beach on June 6 had been a slaughter, but the men who survived it had at least been able to see their enemy. Now, 6 weeks into the campaign, the 29th Infantry Division and dozens of other units were fighting blind. Visibility in the hedgerows averaged 30 yards. Sound carried strangely through the dense vegetation. A rifle shot could seem to come from anywhere or nowhere. German machine gun teams dug into the hedgerow bases had interlocking fields of fire across every approach. Mortar crews, invisible in adjacent fields, could drop rounds with impunity. Snipers tied themselves into trees and picked off officers. Every sunken lane was a potential killing corridor. Every field was a separate battle. And the tanks were dying. The M4 Sherman medium tank was the workhorse of the American Armored Force. A proven design with a 75mm main gun, decent frontal armor, and enough mechanical reliability to cross an ocean and still run. In open terrain, Shermans could maneuver, concentrate fire, and overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers. But the bocage was not open terrain. To cross from one field to another, a Sherman had to assault the hedgerow directly, drive its nose up the earthen bank, push through the vegetation, and drop down into the next field. The physics of this maneuver were unforgiving. As the tank climbed the bank, its hull tilted upward at angles exceeding 30 degrees. The bow rose. The thick frontal armor pointed uselessly at the sky. And the belly, the thinnest armor on the entire vehicle, often just half an inch of steel plate, became exposed to anything waiting on the far side. German infantry knew this. They had been fighting in the bocage for weeks now, and they had refined their doctrine with Teutonic precision. Panzerfaust teams, 2 or 3 men with the handheld anti-tank rockets that could penetrate 4 inches of armor, would position themselves in the next field, crouched low, waiting. They would hold fire while the Sherman struggled up the embankment, engine roaring, treads churning through roots and soil. They would hold fire as the bow rose and the belly came into view. And then, at a range of 30 or 40 yards, they would fire into the softest part of the tank. The shape charge warhead would punch through the thin belly armor, and the jet of superheated metal would ignite ammunition, fuel, or both. Crews called the Sherman the Ronson lighter. It lit the first time, every time. Men burned to death inside vehicles that had been buttoned up for safety. Others bailed out into machine gun fire. Tank commanders learned to dread hedgerow crossings more than open combat. The Americans tried everything. Engineers used explosive charges to blast gaps in the hedgerows, but the explosions advertised the location of the breach to every German position within earshot, and tanks moving through a fresh crater were predictable, channelized targets. The engineers themselves took horrific casualties setting the charges. Bulldozer tanks, Shermans fitted with large-angled blades, could push through vegetation, but the blades added weight, reduced speed, and did nothing to solve the angle problem. The tank still had to climb the bank. The belly still became exposed. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosives designed to clear wire obstacles, could blow holes in hedgerows, but the effort required was immense for each breach, and the noise and preparation time made them impractical under fire. Some crews tried ramming hedgerows at speed, hoping momentum would carry them through, but this often resulted in broken transmissions, thrown tracks, or tanks bellied out on the embankment, immobilized and helpless. By mid-July, the American advance had slowed to a crawl. Entire divisions were grinding forward a few hundred yards per day, field by bloody field. Casualties were mounting. The bocage was supposed to be a breakthrough zone, the staging area for a rapid exploitation into the French interior. Instead, it had become a siege, a static attritional nightmare that favored the defender and consumed men and machines at an appalling rate. Officers began to speak quietly about the possibility of stalemate, of the offensive bogging down entirely as autumn rains turned the Norman soil to mud. The strategic calculus was grim. If the Allies could not break out of Normandy before winter, the Germans would have months to reinforce, to relocate panzer divisions from the Eastern Front, to turn France into a fortress. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen was not thinking about grand strategy. He was thinking about survival. Cullen was a tanker assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit tasked with probing enemy positions and screening the flanks of larger armored formations. Before the war, he had driven trucks in the civilian world, hauling freight across the Midwest, learning engines and mechanics through necessity rather than schooling. He could diagnose a failing carburetor by ear, rebuild a transmission with hand tools, and improvise repairs with whatever materials were at hand. The Army had recognized his mechanical aptitude and made him a tank driver, then later promoted him to sergeant. By July 1944, he had been in Normandy for 5 weeks, long enough to see friends die in burning Shermans, long enough to understand that the Hedgerows were killing tanks faster than factories could replace them. One morning, Cullen found himself near Omaha Beach on a routine supply run. The beach was no longer a battlefield. It had become a vast logistics hub, a hive of activity where men unloaded crates, sorted equipment, and moved mountains of war material inland. The wrecked German beach obstacles still littered the sand and shallows, rusting monuments to the initial landings. Among them were Czech hedgehogs, welded steel obstacles designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. Each hedgehog consisted of 3 heavy steel rails, each about 6 feet long, welded together at the center in a tripod configuration. The rails were thick angle iron, sturdy as bridge girders, and sharp at the ends. Thousands of them had been planted in the surf by German engineers in the months before D-Day, and now they sat abandoned, half buried in the sand, useless now that the beach was secure. Cullen stared at them. His mind, shaped by years of practical problem-solving, began to turn over an idea. The hedgerows were earth and roots. Earth could be moved. Roots could be cut. What if, instead of trying to climb over a hedgerow, a tank could cut through it at ground level? What if the bow of the Sherman never had to rise? What if you mounted blades, heavy steel blades, to the front of the tank, blades strong enough to slice through roots and dirt, blades that would let the tank bore through the hedgerow like a plow through soil? He looked at the hedgehogs again. Thick steel, angle iron, strong welds, already cut to manageable lengths. Cullen approached his commanding officer with the idea. The response was skepticism. Every unit in Normandy had heard a dozen improvised solutions by now, most of them impractical or outright dangerous. But Cullen was persistent. He was a sergeant, respected by his men, known for competence. And the situation was desperate enough that even wild ideas deserved consideration. He was given permission to try. Cullen requisitioned welding equipment and a cutting torch. He salvaged several Czech hedgehog rails from the beach, hauled them to a field workshop, and set to work. The design he conceived was brutally simple. For steel prongs, cut from the hedgehog rails, welded to a frame that could be bolted to the bow of a Sherman tank. The prongs would angle forward and downward, like the tines of a giant fork, positioned to bite into the base of a hedgerow as the tank advanced. The bottom edge of each prong would be sharpened or cut at an angle to maximize penetration. The frame would be heavy, crude, ugly, but it would be strong. He worked through the night, the glow of the welding torch casting harsh shadows in the makeshift shop. Other soldiers watched, curious, doubtful. Tankers had a dark sense of humor about modifications. They had seen too many good ideas fail catastrophically in combat. But Cullen worked with the confidence of a man who understood steel and stress and leverage. By morning, He had a prototype. For jagged steel tusks jutting from the bow of a Sherman, each one nearly 5 feet long, the whole assembly weighing several hundred pounds. It looked medieval, barbaric, like something from a siege engine rather than a modern tank. The men started calling it the Rhino. The first test was conducted in a field near Cullen, a small village a few miles inland from the coast. A hedgerow was selected, nothing special, just a typical Norman boundary, 10 feet high, thick with roots and bramble. The Sherman, now fitted with Cullen's device, was positioned at one end of the field. The crew buttoned up. The engine roared to life, and Cullen, standing outside the tank, gave the signal to advance. The Sherman moved forward, treads grinding, diesel smoke pouring from the exhaust. The steel prongs hit the base of the hedgerow, and for a moment there was resistance. The roots were dense, the earth compacted by centuries of growth. But the weight of the tank, 30 tons of steel and machinery, drove the prongs deeper. The roots began to tear, to snap, to shred under the pressure. The earth split. The tank did not climb. It did not expose its belly. It simply pushed through, the prongs cutting a path at ground level, the bow staying horizontal, the main gun maintaining a clear field of fire. Within seconds, the Sherman had breached the hedgerow and emerged into the next field. Intact, operational, the crew unharmed. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then shouting. Men ran forward to inspect the breach. The hedgerow had been torn open, a ragged gap 6 feet wide, roots dangling like severed nerves. The tank had not bogged down. It had not thrown a track. It had simply punched through an obstacle that had been stopping entire divisions. Cullen stood beside his creation, covered in welding burns and grease, and allowed himself a brief, exhausted smile. The idea worked. Within hours, word of the test reached higher command. Within a day, demonstrations were being conducted for battalion and regimental commanders. Within 3 days, the prototype was shown to officers from V Corps. And within a week, Sergeant Curtis Cullen was standing in a field near Isigny-sur-Mer, demonstrating his improvised device to General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army. Bradley was a quiet, methodical officer, known for his attention to logistics and his willingness to listen to junior soldiers. He watched the demonstration in silence, his expression unreadable. The Sherman with the Rhino attachment breached 3 separate hedgerows in quick succession, each time punching through without hesitation, without exposure, without vulnerability. Bradley asked questions about the weight, the welding, the materials, the time required to fabricate each unit. Cullen answered directly, plainly, without embellishment. He was not a salesman. He was a mechanic explaining a solution to a problem. Bradley made his decision on the spot. Every tank in the First Army would be fitted with Rhino cutters. Production would begin immediately, using salvaged German steel from the beach obstacles and any other scrap metal that could be found. Ordnance units, engineer battalions, and field workshops across the Normandy beachhead were mobilized for a crash fabrication program. Welders worked around the clock. Steel was cut, shaped, welded, and bolted to the bows of hundreds of Shermans. The design was refined slightly. Some units used 5 prongs instead of 4, others adjusted the angle or the length, but the core concept remained Cullen's. Simple, brutal, effective. By late July, entire armored divisions were equipped with Rhino tanks. The psychological effect on American crews was immediate. Tankers who had been dreading every hedgerow crossing now moved with aggression, confidence. They no longer had to expose their bellies. They no longer had to wait for engineers to blow a gap. They could breach on their own terms, under their own power, and they could do it while maintaining combat readiness. The tank infantry teams adapted quickly. Riflemen would suppress German positions while the Rhino tanks punched through. Then the infantry would pour through the gap behind the armor, clearing the next field in coordinated assaults. The pace of advance began to accelerate. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured prisoners and intercepted communications revealed confusion, then alarm. German doctrine in the bocage had been predicated on the assumption that American tanks could not maneuver freely, that they would be channelized into predictable kill zones. The Rhino tanks shattered that assumption. Suddenly, American armor was appearing in fields that had been considered tank-proof, bypassing prepared defensive positions, attacking from unexpected angles. Panzerfaust teams found themselves outflanked before they could set up ambushes. Machine gun nests were overrun by tanks that simply drove through the hedgerows behind them. The static defense that had stymied the Americans for weeks began to unravel. The strategic exploitation came in late July with Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive designed to rupture the German front and unleash American armored divisions into the open terrain of central France. The operation began with a massive aerial bombardment. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 medium bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of high explosives and napalm on a rectangular target zone 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep, just west of the town of St. Lo. The bombing was intended to pulverize German defenses, to stun and disorient the defenders, to create a corridor through which American armor could pour. But even the most devastating bombardment leaves survivors, and German infantry were experts at taking cover, at emerging from rubble to man their weapons. The Americans knew this. They also knew that the bocage on the far side of the bombing zone would still be intact, still capable of slowing an armored advance to a crawl. So the planners did something unprecedented. They held the Rhino tanks in reserve during the initial assault, committing infantry and conventional armor first to probe the defenses and identify weak points. Then, once gaps were identified, the Rhino-equipped units were committed en masse, punching through hedgerows at speed, exploiting breaches before the Germans could reposition reserves. The effect was devastating. On the second day of Operation Cobra, American armored columns broke through the German front line and began racing south and west, bypassing strongpoints, encircling entire battalions, creating chaos in the German rear areas. The Rhino tanks led the advance, breaching hedgerow after hedgerow, maintaining momentum that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. German commanders, accustomed to methodical Allied advances, were caught off balance. Defensive positions that had been carefully prepared were rendered useless when American tanks simply drove around them or punched through adjacent fields. Communication broke down. Supply lines were severed. Entire formations found themselves isolated, surrounded, or in headlong retreat. The German 7th Army, which had been holding the line in Normandy with grim competence, began to disintegrate. Units that had fought the Americans to a standstill in the bocage now found themselves overrun in open country. Panzer divisions, already under strength and low on fuel, were unable to counterattack effectively against the speed and dispersion of the American advance. Within a week of the breakout, American forces had advanced over 30 miles, liberating dozens of towns and capturing thousands of prisoners. The Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement that would trap much of the German forces in Normandy, was beginning to take shape. The quantifiable impact of the Rhino tanks is difficult to isolate from the broader success of Operation Cobra, but the qualitative difference is undeniable. Intelligence assessments conducted after the breakout noted that German defenders were consistently surprised by the speed and direction of American armored thrusts. Prisoners reported that their units had expected hedgerows to provide time to reposition and counterattack, but that American tanks had breached defensive lines faster than orders could be transmitted. After-action reports from American units highlighted the dramatic reduction in tank losses during hedgerow operations. Sherman casualties from anti-tank fire dropped by an estimated 60% in units equipped with Rhino cutters, compared to losses in earlier bocage fighting. The pace of advance, measured in yards per day in early July, was now measured in miles per day by early August. Casualty figures tell part of the story. In the 6 weeks of bocage fighting before the widespread deployment of Rhino tanks, American forces in Normandy suffered approximately 40,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, while advancing roughly 15 miles. In the 3 weeks following the Cobra breakout, American forces advanced over 80 miles while sustaining fewer than 25,000 casualties, despite facing comparable German resistance initially. The difference was not in firepower or manpower. The Americans had always had numerical superiority, but in mobility and shock. The Rhino tanks gave American armor the ability to maneuver in terrain that had previously neutralized it, and that mobility translated directly into tactical and operational advantage. The strategic consequences rippled across the European theater. The rapid breakout from Normandy allowed the Allies to liberate Paris in late August, weeks ahead of pessimistic projections. German forces in France were forced into a chaotic retreat toward the German border, abandoning vast quantities of equipment and leaving the French coastline defenseless. The Allies were able to open additional ports, Cherbourg, Brest, Marseille, accelerating the flow of supplies and reinforcements into Western Europe. The German High Command, already reeling from disasters on the Eastern Front, now faced a two-front collapse. Discussions of a negotiated peace, which some German officers had entertained in the summer of 1944, evaporated as the military situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The war would continue for another 9 months, but the outcome was no longer in serious doubt. And Curtis Cullen? He received the Legion of Merit, one of the higher decorations for non-combat achievement, in recognition of his contribution to the war effort. The citation praised his ingenuity and initiative, his willingness to improvise under pressure. He accepted the medal quietly, without fanfare, and returned to his unit. There was still a war to fight. In September 1944, during operations in eastern France, Cullen was wounded by shrapnel from a German artillery strike. The injuries were serious enough to require evacuation and extended hospitalization. He spent months recovering in England, then was rotated back to the United States as the European War entered its final phase. He never returned to combat. After the war, Cullen returned to civilian life with little fanfare. He was not a public figure. He did not write memoirs. He did not give lectures or appear on television. He returned to the Midwest, to the life of a working man, and the story of his innovation faded into the background noise of a war that had produced countless acts of individual heroism and ingenuity. The Rhino cutters themselves had a short operational lifespan. Once Allied forces broke out of the Normandy bocage and entered the open terrain of central France and the Low Countries, the devices were removed from tanks to save weight and improve speed. They had been a solution to a specific problem, and once that problem no longer existed, they were discarded, cut off with torches and left in French fields to rust. But the idea survived. Military engineers and armor officers studied the Rhino cutter as an example of field expedient innovation, of adaptive problem-solving under combat conditions. The concept of a tank-mounted breaching device became part of American armor doctrine. Modern combat engineering vehicles, machines like the M1 assault breacher vehicle or the armored vehicle-launched bridge, carry direct conceptual lineage from Cullen's improvisation. They are more sophisticated, more specialized, equipped with mine plows and explosive line charges and hydraulic systems. But the core insight remains. Mobility is survival, and obstacles can be breached with the right tool at the right moment. The broader lesson of Curtis Cullen's story is not about technology. It is about the nature of war and the individuals who shape it. History tends to remember generals and politicians, the men who make grand decisions and move divisions across maps. But wars are also won by sergeants who stare at scrap metal and see solutions, by mechanics who understand that problems in combat are often problems of physics and materials, by ordinary men who refuse to accept that a situation is hopeless simply because it has never been solved before. The Normandy breakout was made possible by strategic planning, overwhelming firepower, and the courage of thousands of soldiers. But it was also made possible by a truck driver from the Midwest who spent a night welding steel and changed the trajectory of the campaign. Tens of thousands of American soldiers advanced through the Hedgerows in late July and August of 1944, punching through obstacles that had seemed insurmountable just weeks earlier. Most of them never knew Curtis Cullen's name. They knew only that their tanks could now breach hedgerows, that the nightmare of the bocage was ending, that they were finally moving forward. They did not know that a single sergeant, working with salvaged German steel and a welding torch, had given them that capability. History often works this way, vast outcomes hinging on small moments, anonymous individuals altering the course of events through ingenuity or luck or sheer stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable. Cullen's innovation saved lives. That is the simplest and most profound truth of the story. Every tank that breached a hedgerow without exposing its belly, every crew that survived a crossing that would have been a death sentence weeks earlier, every infantryman who advanced through a gap torn by a Rhino cutter instead of waiting for engineers to blow a breach under fire, all of them owed their survival, in part, to a solution conceived on a beach and fabricated in a field workshop by a man who had never designed a weapon in his life. The German defenders in Normandy, for their part, never adapted to the Rhino tanks. They tried. Intelligence reports describe attempts to lay additional mines, to dig deeper trenches along hedgerow lines, to position anti-tank guns to cover multiple fields simultaneously. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable from their perspective. The bocage had been their greatest defensive asset, and the Americans had nullified it through improvisation. Once the Rhino tanks were deployed in significant numbers, German doctrine in the hedgerows became obsolete overnight. Defensive positions that had been planned and fortified over weeks were bypassed or overrun in hours. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers, who had fought with discipline and competence throughout the bocage campaign, began to surrender in larger numbers as the hopelessness of their situation became apparent. There is a philosophical weight to this. War is often described as a contest of wills, a test of courage and endurance. But it is also, fundamentally, a contest of problem-solving. Armies that adapt, that innovate, that empower their soldiers to think creatively, tend to prevail over armies that rely on doctrine and rigidity. The German military in World War II was highly professional, tactically proficient, and operationally experienced. But it was also hierarchical, bound by tradition, and increasingly unable to respond to the kind of decentralized innovation that the American military encouraged. When a German soldier identified a problem, the solution had to travel up the chain of command, through layers of bureaucracy, to officers who might be hundreds of miles from the front. When Curtis Cullen identified a problem, he picked up a welding torch. This is not to romanticize the American military or to suggest that it was uniquely enlightened. The U.S. Army in World War II was a massive, often inefficient institution, plagued by its own bureaucratic inertia and inter-service rivalries. But it had a culture, imperfect, inconsistent, that valued practical results over procedural correctness. When Cullen's device was demonstrated to General Bradley, Bradley did not form a committee to study the idea or commission a prototype through official channels. He ordered immediate mass production using whatever materials were at hand. That willingness to bypass normal procedures, to empower sergeants and lieutenants and captains to solve problems locally, was a strategic asset as valuable as any weapon. The story of the Rhino cutter is also a reminder of how fragile progress can be, how easily innovations can be forgotten. By 1945, most of the Rhino tanks had been stripped of their cutters, and the devices themselves had been scrapped or abandoned. Photographs of Rhino tanks are relatively rare. Most were taken during the brief period in July and August 1944 when the cutters were in widespread use. After the war, veterans remembered the devices, but the broader public did not. Cullen himself faded into obscurity, his contribution known to military historians but largely absent from popular narratives of D-Day and the Normandy campaign. It was not until decades later, when researchers began compiling detailed accounts of the bocage fighting, that Cullen's story was rediscovered and given the recognition it deserved. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovations emerge in response to immediate tactical problems, achieve dramatic success, and then vanish once the specific conditions that necessitated them no longer exist. The lessons are documented, filed away in after-action reports and doctrinal manuals, but the human stories, the individual moments of insight, the desperate improvisations under fire, are often lost. We remember the battles but forget the breakthroughs. We remember the generals but forget the sergeants. Curtis Cullen did not set out to change history. He set out to solve a problem that was killing his friends. He applied the skills he had learned as a truck driver and mechanic, skills that had nothing to do with military engineering or armored warfare, and he produced a solution that professional engineers had overlooked. His innovation was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was crude, heavy, improvised from scrap metal and desperation. But it worked. And in war, nothing matters more than what works. The men who fought in Normandy, who survived the hedgerows and advanced across France into Germany, carried their own stories, their own moments of fear and courage and loss. Most of them never knew that a single sergeant's ingenuity had altered the calculus of their survival. They knew only that at some point in late July, the tanks stopped dying in the hedgerows, and the advance resumed, and the nightmare began to recede. They did not need to know Curtis Cullen's name to benefit from his work. History is full of such invisible architecture, unseen individuals whose actions ripple outward, shaping events on a scale far beyond their intention or awareness. And so the question lingers, uncomfortable and profound. How many other Curtis Cullens were there, in other campaigns, other wars, other moments of crisis? How many problems were solved by anonymous soldiers whose names never appeared in dispatches or history books? How many battles were won not by grand strategy but by field-expedient ingenuity, by men and women who looked at what was available and imagined what was possible? We cannot know. History records what survives, documents, photographs, testimonies, but it cannot capture every act of creativity, every improvisation that altered the course of events in ways large or small. What we can know with certainty is that wars are not won solely by the men who plan them or the men who fight them, but also by the men who solve them. Curtis Cullen was a solver. He saw a problem that was costing lives and resources and momentum, and he refused to accept that it was unsolvable. He did not wait for orders or approval. He did not defer to experts or insist that someone else handle it. He picked up the tools he knew how to use and he built an answer. That act, that moment of agency in the face of systemic failure, is as much a part of the story of the Normandy breakout as any armored thrust or aerial bombardment. The Rhino cutter was not a perfect solution. It added weight to the tanks, slightly reducing their speed and fuel efficiency. The welds sometimes cracked under stress, requiring field repairs. The prongs occasionally became entangled in particularly dense root systems, forcing crews to reverse and try again. But perfection was never the goal. The goal was to breach hedgerows without dying, and on that measure, the Rhino cutter succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. It gave American tankers a fighting chance in terrain that had been designed, over centuries, to favor the defender. It gave American commanders the operational mobility they needed to exploit tactical successes. And it gave tens of thousands of soldiers the opportunity to advance, to survive, to go home. Curtis Cullen lived for decades after the war, a private man in a world that had moved on from the horrors and heroics of 1944. He did not seek fame. He did not capitalize on his moment of innovation. He simply returned to the life he had known before the war, carrying the knowledge that he had done something extraordinary under circumstances that demanded it. There is a quiet dignity in that, a refusal to let a single moment define an entire life. He had been needed and he had answered, and that was enough. But for those of us who study the war, who try to understand how victory was achieved and at what cost, Curtis Cullen's story is essential. It is a reminder that history is made not only by those who command but by those who create, not only by those who endure but by those who innovate. It is a reminder that the distance between defeat and victory can be measured in small things. A few pounds of scrap steel, a night of welding, a willingness to try something that has never been tried before. And it is a reminder that the most important contributions are often the least visible, the ones that save lives quietly, without fanfare or recognition, in fields and hedgerows where no cameras were present and no historians were watching. The hedgerows of Normandy are still there, green and quiet, marked now by memorials and cemeteries rather than wreckage. Tourists walk the same sunken lanes where American soldiers fought and died. They see the beauty of the landscape, the pastoral calm, and it is difficult to imagine that this was once a killing ground, a place where every field was a battle and every breach was a gamble. The Rhino cutters are long gone, rusted away or melted down decades ago. But the idea persists, embedded in the doctrine and equipment of modern armies, a legacy of the man who looked at a beach obstacle and saw a solution. So if you've listened this far, if this story has stayed with you, I'd like to ask you to do something. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. There are dozens of stories like this one, forgotten moments from history that deserve to be remembered. Hit the like button if you think Curtis Cullen's ingenuity deserves recognition. And here's a question for you to consider, something to discuss in the comments. Do you think modern militaries, with all their advanced technology and rigid procurement systems, still leave room for the kind of improvisation that Cullen demonstrated? Can a sergeant with a welding torch still change the course of a battle? Or have we engineered that kind of creativity out of warfare? I genuinely like to hear your thoughts. And if there's another forgotten innovation or overlooked hero from history you think we should cover, let me know. These stories matter. They matter because they're true, because they're human, and because they remind us that history is shaped not only by the powerful but by the resourceful, not only by those who give orders but by those who refuse to accept that a problem has no answer. Thanks for listening.